back to Access. It's Isaiah, and I'm Ken.
I'm Nicole.
And we're happy to be in the prophets.
Yay! Yeah.
Well, Isaiah, we're going to get just right down to it. Because now we are into a very unique kind of literature, prophetic literature. We have heard about prophets, but we haven't actually heard from the prophets themselves.
Right.
Prophetic writing, just kind of a general kind of thing. We talked about this with prophets. Best not to think of them mainly as forecasters into the future.
Yeah, they're not psychics.
That's right, not psychics, although it definitely matters if what they say comes to pass or not. That is a test of the prophet. But the office of the prophet, what a prophet actually does, is they are God's voice to kings and to priests, to the powers that be, trying to make people mindful that we are not the rulers here. I know, what? And so the prophets are our conscience. They're our little Jiminy Cricket. They're our conscience.
Yeah, but they're usually much more surly.
They're like a mean Jiminy Cricket.
Bitter. Bitter Jiminy.
And no wonder, because do we like people telling us that we're not doing the right thing?
Why you stink?
I don't like that. I like people to say nice things.
They really don't, prophets don't usually show up saying, good job.
Well done.
You guys are on the right track.
Or not the prophets that make it in the Bible.
Right.
Because there are lots of popular prophets who tell the rulers, oh, you're doing very well.
Yes.
Keep it up.
Lots of yes men.
Yeah.
Who are prophets.
But not here.
Nope, these are all the no-mans.
The other thing I'd say, too, with prophets is it's good to cultivate, I would say double vision, but then we have an obstetrician or an eye doctor in our congregation who's told me double vision's not a good thing. So I'm going to say maybe, what do you call someone who can speak to bilingual?
Yes.
So we should hear the prophets in Hebrew as well as in Greek. Meaning, the prophets are Jewish, and we cannot deny that someone like Isaiah speaks to us as the church as well. When we hear, for unto us a child is born, a son is given, and he shall be called Glorious Counselor, Wonderful. We hear that as the Christmas story.
Right.
And that's okay, but what Nicole and I are going to be talking about is that when Isaiah was writing this, Isaiah was writing to a people, to a specific time, to a place. It was about 700 years before Jesus.
And they're not really concerned with a Jesus.
Yeah, Isaiah's point is not to foretell the Christ child, but his point is to speak to the powers that were, and in his case to foretell Hezekiah, the great king.
Yeah.
But what I guess I would invite all of us to be able to do is to hear Isaiah on his own terms, and then also hear the Christmas story as well. And so it's not an either or, but hear both. Use both ears.
Right. Just honor both ways of looking at it.
Does that work for you?
That's fine with me.
Works for me. Sometimes people get upset and say, "What do you mean he's not talking about Jesus?" I'm like, well, if he is, it's secondary.
He doesn't know.
He doesn't know.
Yeah.
So, and I just think we should be faithful enough to Scripture and to Isaiah to at least try to hear what he was talking about in his day before we then rip him out and then use him for our own purposes.
Yeah.
Which is okay too.
And especially when prophets speaking in their day, I think, are a lot more impactful on us today than reading them in the Christian context. You know?
Could be.
The Jewish message is still applicable.
And it is one way to take the teeth out of the prophets.
Yeah.
To say it's just all about Jesus. Then we don't have to listen to this call to justice and kindness and mercy and all these things we find challenging.
And humility. All sorts of things.
So that's kind of prophets in general. Isaiah in specific. This is one book where the authorship makes an enormous amount of difference. because it won't make sense to you as you're reading through it. Because all of a sudden you will jump to a different context. The enemies will change, and you may not notice it. But for instance, Babylon wasn't even a power hardly when at the start of the book for Isaiah. Then all of a sudden Babylon's a big power, and then Persia's a and it's like it's about 700 to 5. It's about 300 years of history in one book. So how do we make sense of this? Scholars talk to us about 3 books within a book. So chapters 1 through 39 are what we call first Isaiah, and that we think is the kind of historic original Isaiah, if you will. And he preached in around 738 to 700, maybe a little bit after there, years before the Common Era, before Christ. And then we have second Isaiah, who's going to be coming chapters 40 to 55. And second Isaiah, the context is in exile.
Yeah.
Big difference.
Big difference.
The southern kingdom where everything's great and the temple's still around in first Isaiah. Second second Isaiah, no temple. We're in Babylon.
Yeah.
Big difference. And then third Isaiah, and a lot of people say to be a little bit careful about third Isaiah. 56 to 66 are the chapters. The language and the themes are so similar to second. They say it may be the same author, the same school, but the context is different. And we're back in Palestine, and it's the restoration.
Yeah.
Tell us about the themes, Nicole.
Okay. So some of these themes are themes that we saw in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Samuel, with Samuel and Nathan as prophets who speak to power. And that's always the relationship, is a prophet speaking to someone powerful, usually a king or a group. And so in the prophetic books, and since Isaiah is the first prophetic book, that theme gets reintroduced, because we've had the wisdom literature as an interlude, and gets brought to the fore. Some other themes for Isaiah in particular would be the reference to covenant.
You like covenant.
I do. Well, I think actually the prophets like covenant, and I like the prophets, so I like it too. And the author of the book that I read about Isaiah likes covenant.
It's hard to go wrong.
It is.
Covenant.
And what was interesting is, when I was reading this summary about Isaiah, is that prophets don't introduce new rules or new laws. They're always hearkening back to covenant, being like, come on, we made a deal, original contract, stick with it. So that is a theme for Isaiah, and he really calls people back to the covenant, and with all I don't know, like, rules of the covenant may feel...
The parameters.
The parameters, the stipulations of, if you're going to be in this covenant, this is how you need to be treating each other and worshiping God.
And particularly with regard to the poor, the orphans, the widow, the prophets are going to be the people who have the eyes for the most vulnerable.
Yes.
And they're going to say, if you want the blessings of God,
you need the responsibilities.
That's right.
Yeah.
With my 5-year-old, and I have a book that says with privilege, and I'll say comes, and he'll say responsibility. But that's kind of what the prophets are doing. What I say.
Yeah. Some other themes are indictments from the Lord of the Lord's people, such as you're not being good to your poor, but also of other nations too.
God is God of everyone.
Of everyone. And the prophets all have an international flavor. And I like that. They're the cafe au laits of the Bible.
Olé.
And then the other major theme that kind of goes along with all these is the Lord's judgment. The judgment is coming, but in the midst of that, there's always redemption.